Okay, can I have your attention, please? Thank you. Thanks very much. Cheers. I've put up on the screen the text number to dial into. Remember to do the first word, hope. It's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Bart McGettrick, who's my boss and the Dean of Faculty, so I have to say nice things about him. But he's also...
Speak up.
He's also somebody whose views on education, I think, chime really nicely with my own, which makes it a lot easier to work for him, because we don't disagree with each other about many things connected with education. He's going to speak to us about relationships at the heart of learning, and with that, I shall hand over to Professor McGettrick. Thanks very much.
Good. Well, very many thanks, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity of saying a few things to you this afternoon about aspects of education. And what I would like to do is to share with you, I suppose, some of the thoughts about education that I think people ought to know about, or at least think about. And just to give you some sort of basis of reflecting on what you'll be doing in the course of this year and indeed subsequent years, and to give some sort of idea of a view of education that isn't just about education as a process of sitting behind a desk and trying to learn or memorize or understand what's being said. So what I'd like to do is to simply outline a few thoughts, and I hope there'll be opportunity towards the end to reflect on it, to comment on areas where you think you disagree with some of these ideas, and please feel free to do that, because the process of education is to a large extent about opening your mind, opening thoughts, opening yourself to new ideas and to ideas that you perhaps haven't thought about. So what I'd like to do is just to begin very quickly by outlining what I think are some of the signs of the times. And I had the opportunity earlier this term already to talk to you about why is it we crush education, formal education, into a few years of people's lives. And I still believe that it is important to think that, yes, there is formal education, but, you know, there's education that goes well beyond schooling. Sometimes we equate education with schooling, and I think that's really a mistake, because education goes on throughout your life. And if you read the signs of the times, there are a few signs of the times that I think one can reasonably talk about. Living in a world, a culture of uncertainty. We live in a terribly uncertain world. And that uncertainty is found in a whole variety of different sort of ways. For example, the idea that knowledge is changing, and it's changing extremely rapidly. I mean, one of the things that you might want to note, if you said, well, how can you demonstrate that? How can you demonstrate the amount of change that there is? Well, let me give you a statistic, and I don't keep too many statistics in my head, largely because they change all the time. But the Library of Congress in the United States has 22,000 new books every working day. 22,000 books, new books or new publications every working day. To me, that is almost impossible to imagine, particularly what it's like to be the guy at the door that accepts all of these. What a job. Unpacking all these books. But 22,000 a day, can you imagine what that's like? They have something like 649 miles of shelving in the Library of Congress. And of course, it's a huge amount of books. It's like having a shelf from here to the south of France. And they're just packing it every day, and 22,000 new books a day. So the idea that knowledge is changing, and that's only books. That's before you get to the internet and all sorts of other places where you're getting knowledge pumped out. So the idea that education is knowledge seems to me to be not a particularly helpful one. Education may have some knowledge in it, but it's not essentially about knowledge. I mean, one of the other things you might want to reflect on is when you look at the changing nature of education. For those of you who have any interest in history, and I won't go into the detail of this, but the first publication of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, which happened to be in Edinburgh in the middle part of the 18th century, what the Encyclopaedia Britannica was an answer to the question, what is worth knowing? What is worth knowing? And it was a discussion that took place between the professors of the University of Edinburgh and the University of Glasgow, that they came together and they said, well, this is what's worth knowing. And they wrote it down. And they actually classified it under headings like English or language and theology and mathematics and science and music and so on, which incidentally was the first time knowledge was classified under those headings in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And that was knowledge that was worth knowing at that time. Now, it would be a ridiculous idea to think that if you want to be educated, read the Encyclopaedia Britannica. I mean, what a ludicrous idea to us that would be. You start at the first page and you just keep reading. But actually, when the first edition was published, they thought, this is what's worth knowing. This is what education's about. So we've moved away from that. So what is education really about? Education is also uncertain because we don't know what the roles of schools are any longer. I mean, is a school a place for vocational education where we're trying to educate you to have a job? Do you think that your education in this university is here to give you a job? Is that the purpose of your education? Or is it a more liberal education, meaning has it a wider purpose, just to make you a more interested and interesting person? That you know where knowledge is and you can go and find it, you get some concepts and ideas. And I think that's a very important question to ask. To my mind, increasingly in the English education system, universities and schools have been driven more and more to become places of vocational education. Employment is important. And I hope all of you, I hope every one of you gets a job. If you want one, that is. I hope you get a job. But that's not the purpose of education. It's a consequence of being educated. It's not. I don't see my job in this university as to get you employment. I hope you get employment. I do hope you get employment because you get a degree, you get a good degree, you've got skills, you've got what the world needs, interesting, exciting people. My interest is in making you an interesting and employable person, but not to employ you. So I'm making that important distinction that I believe you're somebody or you're people who will get employment. But the purpose of education, in my view, isn't just vocational. It's about educating you in the round, in the broadest sense, so that you'll be able to take up a job in due course and you'll have a set of values that will make the world a better place. So it's an important distinction, I think, to make. And the third area is of complexity in the world and signs of the times, is that the nature of students. You are very different people from people I knew at university. You have access to a huge amount of knowledge. And actually, one of the things about your generation that you ought to be conscious of is you have more access or easier access to information than I have. You know how to use computers and facilities and in technology much more than I would have. Now, does that mean that you're better educated? Because you have access to the knowledge, because you know how to use the technology, use the web, use the internet, use Twitter, use all the facilities. And you'll know that better than the generation that's teaching you. And that's for the first time in the culture of our civilization. Here we have the students who have more access or access to more knowledge than their teachers. Now that raises some very interesting questions. And it particularly raises this question about what is it to be educated. To my mind, education is not just about having knowledge or having that access to knowledge. To my mind, education is about relationships. It's the way we create relationships with people. And I want to set out a model of learning for you. In this model of learning, you have to think of this as a double helix. I hope you can interpret that as a double helix. And that double helix, two strands of the helix. And what this is suggesting is that when someone is teaching, they teach two things. First of all, they teach content, knowledge, principles, ideas, concepts, ideas, skills, all these kinds of things. So when I'm teaching you just now, I have in mind certain ideas. And the main idea is that relationships are more important than knowledge when it comes to education. Relationships are more important than knowledge. But when you educate, you do need knowledge. So you need principles, concepts, ideas, skills, and so on. Because you can't teach and have nothing to teach. You need something of substance. But when you teach, you also want someone who has a disposition to learning, a disposition to a love of learning. I want you to enjoy learning. I don't want you to be sitting there bored out your wits. I want you to enjoy it, to think that this is worth listening to. Not sure whether you think it's worth listening to or not, but what I am looking for is the idea that you love learning and that you learn through certain ways of being and behaving and so on. So when you teach two things. You teach the content, and you also teach the love of learning, the enjoyment of learning. And my question is, what joins these two things? What is it in the learning experience that makes people learn, that enjoy learning? And in my view, it is relationships. Whenever I speak with teachers and head teachers and others in schools and people who are in the world of education, not necessarily in schools but elsewhere, I say to them, and I'll come back to this in these few remarks later, children learn through the smiling eyes of the teacher. That's where children learn. They learn through the smiling eyes of the teacher. There's a practical way of thinking about learning, and it's through the smiling eyes of the teacher. It's the relationships that you create, and these relationships, to my mind, are at the heart of learning. And I think there's a fourth aspect to learning, and it's this idea that we learn in emotional and spiritual space. In other words, the teacher and the learner together have to be in an environment which, if it's positive, if that's a positive environment, it feeds the relationships. And in feeding the relationships, we have a greater love of learning, and when you love learning, you learn more. So that's what these four things are designed to bring together. You need to be in a relationship, that relationship developed in a sound emotional and spiritual space. that through that relationship you begin to love learning, and when you love learning, you'll learn more. So that if you think of teaching a child to read, for example, in primary education, you want them to read. That's the top right-hand box. What you've got to do is not just spend time looking through phonics or whatever system you're using, but it's looking at, do they love reading? Will they enjoy learning? And if they do that, how do you get them to do that? By relationships, by sitting with them, talking to them, getting them to love learning. And if you want to improve standards in education, pay attention to the left side of that diagram. Pay attention to the idea that you love learning, and if you love learning, you'll learn more. That's the basic idea. And so what I'm saying is, in my view, relationships lie at the heart of that learning. It raises a question. Can you develop education without a relationship? Can you do it through things like the Open University, where you're just doing it online or just getting a book? In my view, you can be better informed by reading books and looking at television screens and computer screens. But are you better educated? I think the relationship is important, and we have to spend time on those issues of relationship. So it's this diagram that seems to me to give you this sort of sense of relationships at the heart of learning. Relationships are created at the heart of learning. And if I could just take the opportunity of saying, when does this begin in the life of a young person? To my way of thinking, it begins at the beginning of life itself. And one of the areas that I want just to mention in passing, and we could elaborate it later if you wish, but if you think of a young baby of, let's say, 3, 4, 5 months of age, and how does that child learn? Well, the child develops by its brain growing and developing and so on. And the number of connections, just to give you another statistic, the number of cell connections in a 4-month-old baby is about 1 million connections every second. That's the speed of change that's going on in the growth of a child of that age. 1 million new connections every second. Huge amount of cell movement in the developing baby. Now, what happens with babies as they grow, and some of you may well be mothers or fathers and have experience of this, but if you imagine a child lying in a cot and the child is asleep and then the child wakes up, and you'll forgive me if I'm a little sexist about this or a little old-fashioned or whatever it is, but the child is asleep, the child wakes up, the mother picks up the baby, cuddles the baby, looks after the baby, changes the baby's nappy, feeds the baby, talks a little to the baby, puts the baby down, hopes for about 3 or 4 hours of sleep, and when the baby wakes up again, pick up the baby, feed the baby, change the nappy, give them a cuddle, talk to them, put the baby down. And this routine goes on, and the baby's brain develops in the way that a normal, if I can call it normal baby, would develop. And that's fine. Let's take the example of a baby who is lying in a cot and the mother is frustrated or the father is frustrated, and they pick the baby up and they're angry with the baby because they haven't had enough sleep. So they sort of hold the baby too tightly or shake the baby or something like that, and the baby's hurt. The baby exudes a chemical into their brain that stops brain development because they don't want to be hurt. It's a pure instinct. They don't want to be hurt. Exude a chemical into the brain to stop them being hurt. But it stops brain development. And so the baby is fed and put down. The baby sleeps for another hour and a half because they haven't had their nappy changed or whatever. Hour and a half later, baby cries again, mother picks up the baby, changes the nappy, doesn't feed the baby, puts the baby down. Another half hour, the baby wakes up, and there's a frustration beginning to develop between the mother or the father and the baby. And what's happening is that the baby eventually comes to the point of believing, when I waken up, I don't know whether I'm going to be comforted or hurt. So there's a problem that arises. And what happens is that the baby exudes a chemical into the brain to prevent the child from being hurt. It's just an automatic instinct. If that goes on for more than a few weeks, the amount of the chemical that goes into the brain is stopping brain growth, stopping brain development. And so you have the beginning of a problem child, if I could call it that. Someone who doesn't have the brain connections that are working at 1 million connections every second. It reduces right down and brain growth begins to stop. Now you can do something about it. You can do a little bit about it in later life, but generally speaking, if you have been engaged or if you see a child who's been the subject of child abuse, what happens is that you have a problem with learning. And that is a huge issue for people in the field of education. So what I'm saying is it's the relationships that have to be positive, have to be good, have to develop the child, allow the child to develop, and they will learn. If you don't have those relationships, you're in difficulty. In my view, every child should have the right to have a confident relationship with a responsible adult, because that's what will help learning. A confident relationship with a responsible adult. Then you have a chance of someone developing in an appropriate kind of way. So a model of learning is about this approach to learning that is saying develop relationships, because what those relationships do is they create scaffolding in your brain, and that scaffolding is filled in by knowledge. So the idea that people, when people learn, they learn first by the relationships and secondly by knowledge. And that, to my mind, is a vitally important part of what it is to be educated. Develop relationships. Teachers in schools have to develop positive relationships with children, otherwise they won't learn. They'll have problems. When you look at that diagram, the relationships are not there, things begin to fall apart. There's not a love of learning, there isn't learning going on in the way that you would want. So that idea of developing relationships is absolutely central to what effective learning is about. Teaching in schools. We should make sure that when we teach in schools that we don't just give information, but we actually form people, or I should say transform them. We are capable of transforming people. People who educate transform lives. They change lives and there's no going back. They change the lives of people and there's no going back. And we have a shift in responsibility, not just from the... It's not just a question of the teacher being someone who is important in all of this, but the student, the learner, the importance of the learner. And I think in the world of education, we should try to develop a situation where the person who is learning wants to learn. It's not the fact that they are just learning, but they might want to learn. You transform them by the way in which you're trying to educate them so that they want to learn. To my mind, all effective education is based on the right relationships, allowing the learner, the student, to flourish through the confident relationship with a responsible adult. That's what I believe we have got to try to do as people who are interested in education. And that's not just about knowledge, that's not just about examination performance, it's not just about doing assignments well. It's about freeing the entire spirit. In that regard, education is always, as I use the word here, incarnated. It exists. Where do you find education? You don't find education on a piece of paper. You don't find it on a class list. You don't find it in a timetable. Where you find education is in the hearts of people. If you say, where do you look for education? It's in people. It's in the very person themselves. So when you're looking at the educated person, look at what you're doing in changing people. I make no bones about it. When you come to university, and if my job is to try to educate you, I want to change you. I want to change you. I want to make you develop so that your gifts and talents are available for everyone, and you make a better world as a result. And the curriculum is a means to the end. What you learn, what you're learning just now, if you're learning anything, is not something which is important just in itself, but it's important because it tries to make you a better person. I want to try and make you someone who's more free, more liberated in your thinking, not hemmed in by views of education that are about examination passes. Now, of course, we need exams, we need assignments, we need all that kind of part of education. But what we need more than anything are people who are creative, inventive, and who will serve others. And sometimes we might need to protect children from the worst excesses of education. Because I think sometimes our exam system, for example, is actually not allowing children to flourish. It's not allowing them to develop in the ways that you would want. I've just got two final thoughts, and I'll flick through some of these slides just to say this. A Celtic way of thinking of it, and you'll hear from my accent that I haven't yet got a Scouse accent, but always walk with two steady feet. One in the spiritual world of the here and in the spiritual world, and one in the world of the here and now. What's happening day in, day out. But remember, there's more to life than is necessarily going on in the here and now. A sort of mystical idea that there's something beyond us that is important, that allows us to dream, to have great thoughts and vision and so on. Never get rid of that. Otherwise you just become like a computer or something like that. You've got to allow yourself to dream and have great thoughts. Where are we going to get the great authors of the future, the great thinkers, the poets, the people who will make new kinds of buildings, the people who will make great changes in the world, if we don't have people who can dream? I think the danger in education is we are driven by such operational aspects that we don't see that as important any longer. I think that's vital to the human condition. And finally, let me just say, if I were looking at the educated person, it would be this: the person who acts through love and care and compassion. A person who cares for beauty and wonder, who has a sense of hope in a better future, and who will serve the world by their gifts. That, for me, is the educated person. A person of love, care and compassion, the relationships at the heart of it. A person who cares about beauty and wonder, because that's what makes us deeply human. A person who hopes in a better world, and a person who will serve the world by using whatever gifts they have. That's what I believe it is to be educated, and I believe that at the heart of that is the relationships that we create with our teachers and with each other. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Okay, as usual, lots of good questions. And if anyone comes up with any questions as we're dealing with these questions, feel free to text in or even stick your hand up and just ask them out loud. That's fine. I do want to destroy relationships a little bit for a second, because somebody, at least one person, was texting through saying, I wish people around me would stop talking. And Bart and I sit at the front, can't really hear what's going on so easily. And if there are people around talking, be aware that you're putting off other people. It's not very fair. Anyway, putting that to one side. A few questions early on, Bart, came in that overlap. So I've got 3 questions that we can treat as one, I think. So here's the first bit. If education for you isn't about employment, but students are mainly here for a half-decent job in the future, does that not pose a big problem for university? Well, I'll give you the next bit, yeah? To encourage children to focus, teachers often stress the importance of qualifications for getting work. How can that be changed? And then I think this is me adding a bit on. If education is about work, then what sorts of relationships between teachers and students will come from that?
Well, I think to go back to something, just to elaborate maybe a little bit on what I was saying, I do understand that people come to university so they get, to quote, a half-decent job. I hope indeed a decent job, not just a half-decent one. And I think that is very important that people gain employment. I have no difficulty with that whatsoever. I suppose what I'm saying is, however, I think that is a result. It's the result of getting a good education that will allow you then to apply for jobs and to be appointed for jobs. It's a result of that. But I don't consider it to be a purpose that I would have in getting you a job. It's not. This isn't a kind of, if I may say, a sort of 3 or 4 year rush towards employment. That if that's what it was, we'd be doing all sorts of different things, I think. We wouldn't just be looking at employment. Because what I want to do is to say to you, the university is to give you an experience that makes you, that develops your talents, your gifts, your ideas, your relationships with other people, both with other colleagues in the class, but also with staff in the university. It's to do all that kind of thing, and that's what makes you more human and gives you a richer kind of life. Hopefully, as a result of that, you'll get a job. And that when you get a job, if you're going to be a teacher, you will be someone who will pass on to other generations to say, I want to educate you. I want to make you somebody who is someone who cares about other people, has a sense of compassion, a sense of beauty, a sense of hope, and who will serve the world. Because actually, at the end of the day, frankly, for my education would be a complete waste of time. A complete waste of time if somehow I didn't make your life more complete. That's how I would see it. Because it's to serve others. What's the purpose of life? Serving others. It's as simple as that. It's not to serve myself. I mean, I may enjoy reading books or watching computer screens or whatever, but actually the only purpose I have is to try and serve others. And I hope at the end of my days, I'm not remembered for someone who created lists on a bit of paper or had some sort of sense of efficiency in administration, but rather that I touched the life of at least one person. Then it'll be worthwhile. And I genuinely believe that. I genuinely believe it's just to touch the life of someone else makes my life worthwhile. And I hope that would be true of you, and that's what I want to try and pass on.
And what about the second part of that, which was that teachers often use this as a method for getting young people to focus and be disciplined?
To be qualified. Yeah, and I can see why teachers do that, because, I mean, you wouldn't be in the university had you not got good qualifications. So, I mean, but it's a means to the end. And I suppose it's trying to separate out these things, that good examination performance, good results, getting a good degree is a means to the end. It's not the end in itself. The end in itself is making a better world, whatever way we do it. And you don't always need qualifications to make a better world, but it helps. It gets you into, in our society, it gets you into a position of influence of others. And so that idea of a qualification, I can see why teachers do that. I also wish teachers would say, of course, this is just so that it's a means to the end. It's not the end in itself. But I can also see why people say, well, it may be a means to an end for you, but for me it's the end. I want a job. I've got to get a job if I'm going to keep body and soul together. I hope the job is one that just makes the world a better place, and that's what would make me feel that you're an educated person. So it's that difference between means and ends, you know, and often they get mixed up in education. I was saying in the second last slide there, the curriculum is a means to the end. You hear people talking about education as if it was the learning of maths and English and history and geography and music that was the end point of education. Not for me, it's not. The curriculum is a means to the end. Learning about educational studies, hopefully, is interesting. It's a means to the end. It's a means whereby you get a degree and you make the world a better place as a result.
Okay, two questions I'm pulling together from early on and late recently. So some of the greatest artists stroke scientists were self-taught. Doesn't that mean that the internet could replace schools? And allied to that, do you think that modern technology is dehumanizing society?
On the last one, I think it certainly has the potential to do so, and when it's abused, it does dehumanize society. I think that there is that you can dehumanize society by an excessive use of technology. I think that education is about relationships and about making society more human and being together. Frankly, and let's not get into a great debate about this, but you know, the groups of 10 that you're involved with within the faculty, that is to try and humanize education. It's so that you talk to each other and you talk to your tutor. It's to make it more human, it's to make it interactive. The intention is that it allows you to discuss with one another certain key aspects of education. It's to make it more human. I don't think your education would be complete or nearly as complete if it was simply this kind of exercise of one voice talking to a large audience such as this. I think that is a kind of dehumanizing of education, where the real humanity is when there's interaction. Those relationships are key to me. The idea that some of the great scientists were self-taught and some of the great artists were self-taught, they all lived in communities, you know. They all lived in certain communities, and what makes a genius, I think, is another source of discussion. You do get people who take great leaps of ideas, of confidence. You know, who were the great thinkers that took, or who are the great thinkers? Because I think it's still going on. When I hear of the people who are setting up arrangements of looking at communication on Mars and outer space and so on, there are people thinking some hugely interesting thoughts in all sorts of areas. And these are important. So these great thinkers are still among us. I think that one of the things that we need to do is to think very hard about making a better world where, frankly, while we can get to Mars and outer space, who's solving the problems of children in Syria? Who's sorting out these world problems? Just hearing the other day of children in Syria with TB. They are riddled with tuberculosis because they've been underground for the last 6 or 9 months. They've hardly seen daylight, and they're dying in their hundreds. We never hear of that. The great work of our time is maybe just in creating people who will solve those problems. Getting to outer space is great and it's wonderful, and engineers are amazing in the way they think. maybe the future is just to help human beings through compassion and love for our fellow human beings and create a world of justice and peace. That too is, I think, a great issue for the future. So great thinkers, yes. Great people to make a better world. We need them more than ever.
I think this one, you can just clarify this issue. The question says, are those who have conditions like ADHD and brain development issues, remember when you were talking about shaking the baby and so forth, are these people who've not had good and proper relationships?
Not always, no. The various conditions can arise from a whole variety of different sorts of reasons. I mean, you get quite a lot of issues arising, for example, children with cerebral palsy because of difficult births and things of that kind. So it's not all about relationships, it's about other things as well. But if I say too often it is about relationships, and these are things we can avoid. These are things we can avoid and should avoid.
Last question, I think, before we call it a day. If relationships are so important, then don't we need to go back in order to educate parents properly that haven't experienced a good education as well as children?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Whoever has been asking that question, sometimes I think we just educate the wrong generation. And actually what we should maybe do, if you're looking for education in 50 years' time, what will it look like? I hope it will involve children and parents together.
Thanks very much, Bart.
Thank you.